Action Partnership. Thank you so much for tuning in to the third webinar in our strategic planning series, Developing an Outcomes-Based Strategic Plan. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we jump on in to the slides. First of all, I want to make sure everybody knows that we post all of our webinars and the slide decks under our Tools and Resources page on the Partnership main web page. So you can access the recordings and the slides from the previous two webinars in this series on the Partnership page, and we should have the recording and slides from this webinar posted within the next couple of days. So if you have any trouble accessing those recordings, just let myself, Courtney Kohler, or Liza Chorus on our team know, and we can make sure that we get you those materials. Also, want to make sure that everyone knows we have one more webinar in this series to come. We'll show you the date for that at the end of today, but we'll be concluding our 4-webinar series on strategic planning, and we'll be announcing shortly a couple of shorter webinar series, 2 webinars each, on designing a customer satisfaction system and conducting a succession planning process. So we'll be continuing our Organizational Standards Center of Excellence webinar series with a couple of shorter 2 webinar series coming up, and those will be announced shortly in the next couple of days, so just keep your eye out. And also, please feel more than free if you have any suggestions for additional webinars to just let myself, Courtney, or Liza know. We'll be continuing the series throughout the current year to make sure that we're providing you with webinars on high-priority training and technical assistance issues and needs. During the webinar, we'll take questions as they come in. We will stop at various points. You are all on mute upon entry, just so we can cut down on the background noise, but please feel more than free to send us questions through the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll answer them in order as they come in. You can also message Liza Chorus directly if you're having any technical issues with your sound or your video. I just want to quickly have Courtney Kohler introduce herself before we get going. And Courtney, are you all connected, or you still need to get your audio up and running?
Nope, I'm all connected. I'm Courtney Kohler, and I am the Senior Associate with the Community Action Partnership. And so I work with the Organizational Standards Center of Excellence as well as the Learning Communities Resource Center.
Great, thanks so much, Courtney. And Courtney and I will be tag teaming throughout this afternoon to bring you the webinar, which we will start right now. So, Courtney, if you can go ahead and hit record, or Liza, just to make sure that we've got this on record for everyone, and we will start right now. So moving forward, just to briefly walk through the agenda for this afternoon or late morning if you're joining us from the coast. We're going to focus in on a couple of things, but the big picture one is making sure that when you are doing your strategic plan, you're using ROMA principles and practices to really write an outcomes-focused strategic plan. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the process to design and develop your strategic plan. We're going to quickly review what we talked about the last time, collecting data, make sure that you've got that transition all connected between wrapping up your research process and actually writing your strategic plan. And then the balance of the time, we're going to focus on talking about outcomes, strategies, and actions, the 3 components of a good strategic plan, and we'll go into a lot more detail about how to make sure that, again, you are writing a good plan that uses results-oriented management accountability principles and practices. Also want to make sure that everybody knows about the resources on the Partnership webpage. We do have a comprehensive guide to community action strategic planning that is available on the Partnership website, and it covers much of the content in this webinar series in additional detail. It also provides links to other web pages, other guides, so it's really your one-stop shop for doing a strategic planning process, and we always recommend that our agencies use our guides even if you adapt it, even if you use a slightly different approach than the one described in the guide, this will help make sure that you are doing a strategic plan that takes into account what community action agencies need to do for strategic planning. So it covers ROMA, it covers requirements of the CSBG Act, and it covers the organizational standards to make sure that you're meeting all of those. You can get this guide by going to our webpage. You see in yellow there the Tools and Resources section on our webpage is circled. If you go to our Tools and Resources and our Guides section, it is about halfway down the page, and you can access it that way, or you can just write Courtney or myself, and we will send you an electronic copy directly. And you can also get the recordings of the webinars and the slides also under that Tools and Resources section under our Webinars link. So make sure that you visit this page. We also have a lot of other resources for you. So make sure you check back regularly, because we're always updating our resources with new guides, new tools, new webinars, and other great resources for our network. So to start off, we are now at stage 3 in developing your strategic plan, actually writing your strategic plan. So again, you've now finished up stage 2. You've collected your internal agency resources, things like your last strategic plan, your needs assessment, your customer satisfaction data, your agency program and service data from your outputs and your outcomes, your agency budget, any other documents that are helpful in developing your strategic plan. You've done your SWOT analysis, and you've also reviewed your vision, mission, and overall, and your values for your agency from a big picture perspective. So you've collected all of this information together, and my guess is that you have something that looks a little bit like this. I'm sure all of you have seen pictures that are made up of hundreds or thousands of little dots of color. So when you're up close, it just looks like a riot of different colors. So that's like all the different data points that you've collected. So what you're trying to do is take that step back and see the big picture. See what emerges out of all the data that you've collected, see what themes and trends rise to the surface, and so you're really building your strategic plan on the foundation of the data that you've collected during that stage 2. You've looked at your agency data, the data from your SWOT analysis, the data from your review of your vision, mission, and values, and hopefully out of that will begin to emerge the big picture that will become your strategic plan. So again, I want to emphasize the importance of making sure that you are tightly connecting your strategic plan to your community needs assessment. So this slide just simply shows you and re-emphasizes the importance of making sure that connection is there. So when you're writing your strategic plan, you always want to make sure that you're guided by that needs assessment and that you're working from those hopefully high priority needs that you've identified in your assessment. And then as you begin to develop your strategic plan, and we'll talk in more detail about that, you are identifying outcomes that, if they are achieved, will help address one or more of those high priority needs that you've identified in your needs assessment. And you should ask yourself some basic diagnostic questions. Do the outcomes in our strategic plan address at least one need from our needs assessment, and are they aligned with our overall mission? And again, we'll talk in a lot more detail about how to develop outcomes and what goes into that process. But then continuing that through, you'll be developing strategies that help you achieve those outcomes. And so you're making sure that your overall strategic plan is comprehensive. It covers the entirety of your agency's programs, services, and other activities, those outcomes that you're hoping to achieve in the community with the individuals and families, neighborhoods and broader communities that you're working with, and also outcomes related to your agency. And again, we'll cover how you go through that process as we continue through the slides. But just want to make sure that we're emphasizing that your strategic plan should be closely connected with your needs assessment. You should be able to draw a line between every outcome and at least one need that you've identified in your needs assessment. So to move on, I just want to talk briefly about your process options for actually writing your strategic plan. One of the mistakes that I sometimes see agencies make is rushing through the process when you're actually writing your strategic plan. And that may seem to be the most efficient way to go about it, just delegate the process to a consultant or do a 1 or 2 day retreat with just a couple of people to go ahead and knock it out. And I want to encourage agencies to make sure that you're giving the time really required to go through the process of looking at your outcomes, developing your strategies, being thoughtful, and being truly strategic to make sure that you're giving this part of the process the time that it really needs to take that big picture approach. So there are a couple of different options available to agencies for actually writing the strategic plan. I would encourage you to look at the different process options, find one that fits your agency. Smaller agencies can probably do this process a little bit more quickly. You might be able to fit the entirety of your agency around one conference table to actually write the strategic plan. But if you're a medium-sized or a larger agency, there are a couple of different process options available to you, and again, the guide goes into a little bit more detail about what those are. But a couple of them would be a committee and task group option, and so you would charge a larger committee with actually writing the strategic plan, and you would break up into smaller task groups to develop particular outcomes, maybe one task group looking at outcomes for the agency, another task group looking at outcomes for the individuals, families, and communities that you're serving. There are a bunch of different ways you could divide that up, but in that way, you're breaking the plan down into its component parts, assigning smaller groups of people to develop it, and you move back and forth between these small group and large group meetings where the individual task groups, or whatever you choose to call them, report back on their results. The whole group takes a look at it, provides them with feedback, and you move back and forth until your plan is written. Another approach that I've seen used is the open space method, where you're gathering a larger group of folks together, typically in one large room. You usually have different stations set up around the corners, different corners of the room, and folks move from one station to another, providing facilitators with feedback, typically about the outcomes that they think the strategic plan should address, additional feedback about the strategies that you might want to develop, and that way you can get feedback from a larger number of people relatively efficiently. And then you would usually break up into smaller groups to wordsmith those different sections. But that's a way to get, again, have a more participatory process. And this has been a theme we've been talking about throughout this webinar series, the importance of making sure that you are using a participatory, inclusive, and collaborative process throughout the development of the strategic plan to make sure that you're getting perspectives from different parts of the agency, even sometimes perspectives from your customers, your other partners in the community. And that really makes sure that you have buy-in to your strategic plan, and that it is truly a document that represents the different perspectives of your agency and draws on the skills and experience of folks in different places. Another approach to writing your strategic plan would be to use a team-based approach where you might divide up the writing of the strategic plan by different parts of the agency. So, for example, your HR staff would work on outcomes related to your HR function. Your program staff and leadership team might work on outcomes related to your programs and services. Your finance staff would develop outcomes related to your finance and budgeting functions, et cetera, et cetera. So you would divide it up by the functional units within your agency. Again, that helps you draw on different perspectives. People who are sort of closest to the issues are the ones who are doing the development and fine-tuning of the strategic plan. So that's just another way to break up the process. And then, of course, you come back into groups that take representatives from each of those smaller groups to review their work, to provide them with feedback. And again, you're going back and forth between a group of folks from all over the agency to those teams that are located in different parts of the agency until you've got your final strategic plan. And then the last option would be the retreat with a small group to do most of the writing. Again, I generally counsel against that because, as you'll see, there are multiple steps in writing the strategic plan, so you want to make sure that there is enough time given to actually go through all the different parts of the process to really be strategic. But again, if you're a smaller agency, you may be able to do this a little bit more quickly. But again, for me, the bottom line is make sure that you've chosen a process that works for your agency. Don't feel locked into one particular approach, and make sure that you're giving this part of the process the time that it really requires. And again, we'll talk through those steps right now. So what you see on your computer is an exercise that I usually do when I'm doing trainings in strategic planning. And I think one of the things that folks sometimes get hung up on right from the very beginning of strategic planning is the language that they use. We do use different words to describe things like outcomes, goals, milestones, indicators. And for me, it's just important to make sure that the people who are writing the strategic plan all share the same assumptions about what the language they use means. Otherwise, they might go off in different directions. They might have a very different understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. So if you look at all the words on the left-hand side of your screen, these are ones that are commonly found in strategic plans, and I want to try to make this as simple as possible. We are going to counsel that your strategic plan focus on three things. You want to define the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, the strategies that you're going to use to achieve those outcomes, and then the concrete actions or action plans that are required to implement the strategies, especially anything new that you're trying to do with your strategic plan. So this language is also consistent with the ROMA framework. That's why I prefer outcomes, strategies, and actions. In ROMA, we talk about outcomes and using an outcomes-based approach to planning. So I think your ROMA trainers will be especially helpful as you're crafting your strategic plan to make sure that you're being consistent in your use of language. But generally, make sure you're on the same page. Make sure that the folks who are writing the strategic plan understand the language that you're using, and that's where your ROMA trainer can often come in handy. And we'll talk in more detail about what is an outcome, what is a strategy, and what is an action or an action plan. So you're finished with your research process. You've decided on what process you're going to use to actually write your strategic plan. So what this slide contains is just some suggestions to make sure that folks are on the same page. People might not have participated in all the different things that you did to gather data. Not everybody might have participated in the SWOT analysis or been familiar with the results. Not everybody might have been around the table as your board and leadership team were reviewing your vision, mission, and values. So you need to make sure that you've taken the time to have everyone who is actually writing the strategic plan have read through and understand what's come up to this point. So at the very beginning, make sure that people are familiar with the needs assessment. Ideally, the folks who are writing the strategic plan have read through the entirety of the needs assessment, but at a minimum, make sure that they've read the executive summary and are familiar with those high priority needs that you've identified and prioritized. Next, make sure that the folks around the table doing the writing of the strategic plan have reviewed what came out of your SWOT analysis, looking at your strengths, your weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And as Courtney and I talked in the previous webinar, hopefully what you've done is taken all the dozens or even hundreds of individual data points that came out of your SWOT analysis and roll them up into some general themes that you've identified as needing to inform your strategic plan. So don't just hand folks a sheet with hundreds of different individual pieces of feedback. Make sure that you've got some kind of summative document that goes through and identifies the different large themes that emerged out of that SWOT analysis. You also want to make sure that everybody is familiar with what came out of the results of your review of your vision, mission, and values. And so just a summary, hopefully you took notes as you went through that process. But again, you're looking for those themes that came out of your discussion about whether your programs and services are aligned with your mission, How siloed are your programs and services? Are you really connected to the needs that you've identified in your needs assessment? So those big picture discussions that hopefully have taken place in the data gathering or second stage of your strategic planning process. You also, at this point, want to make sure that you've reviewed any key agency data that you gathered, again, as part of your research process. So a review of your outputs and outcomes for your various programs and services, your agency budget, your customer satisfaction data, and any reports that are going to be helpful in writing your strategic plan. So, for example, if you have a report on trends related to workforce issues or issues with housing in your community, reports that might have been done by an advocacy organization, a public agency, a foundation, or similar source, you want to make sure that folks, again, are at least familiar with the big picture points. They don't have to read every single document, but you want to make sure that people have, at least in summary form, the data that you collected through that second stage of the process. At this point, you would identify, discuss, and prioritize key strategic issues that face the organization. So you take all that data that you collected and see what rises to the top in terms of those key strategic issues. And only then do you want to begin actually developing and prioritizing the outcomes that are going to be the first thing that you develop in your strategic plan. So at this point, I want to stop, see if any questions have come through. Liza, anybody send anything through? Okay. So again, folks, feel more than free to submit questions through that chat or Q&A function. And again, you can also send questions directly to Courtney and myself. We're more than happy to follow up in more detail. All right, so what this slide shows is the big picture of what is going to be included in your strategic plan. You want to make sure that you're identifying those outcomes, strategies, and actions. So just to walk through each level of your strategic plan, your outcomes address the strategic issues that you've identified as part of the research process. They should be aligned with your mission, and they should meet the needs that you've identified in your needs assessment. And sort of one handy rule of thumb is that outcomes should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely, and we'll show you some examples of some outcome statements in just a second. Now, the next level of your strategic plan is your strategy. So for every outcome that you develop, you will have one or more strategies that describe how you're going to go about achieving that outcome. So some outcomes may just have one strategy. Other outcomes may have 2, 3, 4, or even more strategies. And so that is, the big picture. The strategies are the collective description of how your programs, services, and other agency activities contribute to achieving the outcomes that you've identified that address at least some of the needs that you've identified in your needs assessment. Of course, as we've been saying, your strategic plan doesn't have to address all of the needs identified in your needs assessment, but it's a way, as it sounds, to be strategic, to decide which of those needs you're going to address and how you're going to address them. And then finally, your actions or action plans are concrete descriptions of how you're going to implement your strategies, especially anything that you decide to do new or different as part of your strategic planning processes. As Courtney and I will discuss as we go through each level of your strategic plan, probably most of your strategic plan will be describing things that you already do, your programs and services, your related agency activities, but at least part of your strategic plan should describe things that you're going to do to improve your programs and services, maybe referral agreements with additional partners to provide more comprehensive services, maybe participating in campaigns or community collaboratives, or going after a grant to implement a new program or service. And so, especially with these new strategies that you decide to pursue, you want to make sure that there is a very clear, detailed action plan that describes how you're going to go about implementing that, so you make sure that you continue to move forward with your strategic plan and it doesn't just end up gathering dust on a shelf. So let's talk a little bit about deciding on outcomes. How do you decide on the outcomes that are going to really form the foundation of your strategic plan? So I think the first question that you need to ask yourself is, what are your high priority needs from your community needs assessment? As I've said, and I'll probably say at least another time or two, every outcome in your strategic plan needs to address one or more needs that you've identified in your needs assessment. You don't have to address absolutely all of them, but again, that's why it's called a strategic planning process. It's about going through those needs and saying, here are the needs that we have the resources, the expertise to actually address, and here's how we go about prioritizing that and developing strategies that hopefully move us closer to improving outcomes in the various areas where we're doing our work. Another important question to ask is, what is your mission? You want to make sure that your outcomes are connected to your mission, that you're not developing a strategic plan that's going to result in mission drift. So you're looking at those core business areas that you've identified as part of stage 2. So again, we always suggest our agencies ask themselves, are you the transportation, workforce development, and housing agency? Are those your core business areas? Are you the early care and education and weatherization and energy efficiency agency? So what are sort of the core areas that you're doing your work? Make sure that they're connected with the needs you've identified in your needs assessment, and those will help you identify what kind of outcomes you're trying to achieve. Again, you also want to ask, what is the overall level of impact you want to achieve for your outcomes? So, there are a number of different ways of writing outcome statements. I think this is a great place to make sure that your ROMA trainer or ROMA implementer is providing you with good advice. But you can write outcome statements in a couple of different ways. The two of the main ones would simply be if you want to go the big picture route, maybe have a stretch goal. Your outcome statements might be something like your agency, the ultimate outcome you're trying to achieve is to eliminate poverty in your service area. Now, of course, that's a stretch outcome. Some agencies want to have something more concrete. So you could say that the outcome you're hoping to achieve is to cut poverty by 50% or maybe provide 150 jobs a year to low-income residents of your service area. So part of what you're doing here is trying to figure out how you're going to frame up your outcomes. And so there's no one way to do this. Part of it depends on how ambitious that you want to be, what outcomes you've been able to achieve, what outcomes you hope to achieve in the future. So your ROMA trainer will really help make sure that your outcomes are consistent with that, with those SMART guidelines. But the most important thing is to make sure that they are measurable and specific, and we'll give you a couple of examples in the next few slides. You should also ask, does the outcome really address the underlying cause of the need? So hopefully in your needs assessment, you've done that analysis of the causes and conditions of poverty, and you're asking yourself, do our outcomes really get at those underlying causes, or are they outcomes that are maybe just sort of treating the surface symptoms or the conditions of poverty without really getting at the underlying causes? So for example, you could have an outcome that says we want to provide programs and services that provide food security for all low-income residents in our service area. Now, the question, of course, would be, does providing food security, things like food pantries, food boxes, home delivery of low-cost meals, while that certainly is admirable and it might be an outcome that you want to achieve, does that really get at the underlying causes of poverty? Does that get at the reason why people need emergency food services in the first place? So when you're thinking about your outcomes, think about being strategic, make sure that you're really trying to address the underlying causes of poverty rather than just treating the surface symptoms or the manifestations of poverty. And one tip is to divide your outcomes into internal and external buckets. As we've said in the previous webinars, your strategic plans need to be comprehensive. They can't just focus on internal agency outcomes, things like maybe diversifying your sources of revenue, maybe improving your HR function, providing new training. Those are all certainly things that you could consider in your strategic plan, but you need to have both outcomes for the individuals, families, and communities you serve, and also for your individual agency. So just a simple way of doing that is asking, what are the outcomes that we need to achieve as an agency, maybe related to HR, finance, again, sort of those functional units of your organization, and then what are the outcomes that we want to achieve for the individuals and families and communities that we serve. So just make sure that your strategic plan addresses both halves of that coin, internal agency outcomes and then those external outcomes. And one of the things that we've seen sometimes in strategic plans is they tend to be too internally focused. So you want a comprehensive strategic plan that really covers all aspects of what your agency is doing, both your activities inside your agency and what you're doing and hoping to achieve, again, for those individuals, families, and communities that you serve. So let's show you one example of how those different levels in the strategic plan fit together. So I know it might be a little bit difficult to read on the screen, but our hypothetical agency has decided that one of their outcomes is that all low-income individuals and families in their service area will have access to affordable, quality child care. So hopefully that agency has identified child care as a high priority need in their community needs assessment. They've determined that it is one of their core business areas, or at least an area where they have decided to do business, and that it's aligned with their mission overall. And of course, there's some other ways that you could phrase that as an outcome. You could say the outcome we hope to achieve is to provide access to affordable quality child care for 100 children with low incomes or children from families with low incomes in our service area. So you could talk about the number of children that you would want to serve. You could say we want to provide high quality child care high quality affordable child care for at least 50% of all low income children in our service area. So there are a number of different ways that you could describe that outcome, and again, that's part of what you're doing in this stage. You're trying to figure out what you're hoping to achieve, how you're going to frame that in a way that really communicates the ultimate impact of what you're doing as an agency. At that next level, you can see this agency has decided to pursue two strategies to achieve that particular outcome. The first strategy is that they're going to increase the availability of high-quality child care slots. And the second strategy is that they're going to develop a child care policy agenda to advocate for higher quality child care, more resources, and things like that. So for the first strategy, increasing the number of high quality, affordable child care slots, there are two actions that they're going to take. First of all, they're going to develop a fee-for-service child care center. That would, of course, at least in theory, increase the availability of high-quality, affordable child care slots. And then the second action they're going to take is to develop training for home providers to improve the quality of existing child care providers in their service area. Under the second strategy, developing a child care policy agenda, they're just going to take one action, which is convene local partners to develop a policy agenda around child care related issues. So hopefully you can see how you're moving from the outcomes at the top level to the strategies that you're going to pursue to implement to achieve those outcomes, and then the actions that you're going to take to realize or achieve those strategies. And so we're going to walk through each of these levels in a little bit more detail and talk about how you develop each of them, but I want to give you one more example This one for an internal agency outcome. So another outcome this agency has decided is that they want to increase unrestricted revenue by 30% in 3 years. So, let's assume they look at their budget, they look at their overall sources of funding, and they realize that too much of their funding is restricted. It limits what they can do with it. So they want to increase access to unrestricted revenue so they can spend it more flexibly, hopefully to invest back in the agency in other activities that will ultimately improve services. Or otherwise strengthen the agency's internal capacity. So they've identified 2 strategies that they're going to pursue. First, they're going to develop fee-for-service programs because that generates an increase in unrestricted revenue. And secondly, they're going to increase charitable donations, which would obviously give them, unless those funds are earmarked, more flexible revenues. So they're going to take 2 actions under developing those fee-for-service programs. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to expand fee-for-service slots in their child care centers. So perhaps they're going to add a few slots that serve parents with children who are above poverty. They're going to put in a sliding scale, increase their revenues, and generate some unrestricted money that way. And then secondly, they're going to market their food service program. So let's say this agency has a food service program that they use to provide meals to their child care center. They've discovered that they can they're producing an excess number of meals, so they're going to sell those to other child care centers, which would, of course, increase their unrestricted revenue. Under increasing charitable donations, the one thing they're going to do is hold an annual fundraiser, which would obviously increase unrestricted revenue. So again, you see how they're moving from outcomes to strategies to action. So hopefully it's a little bit clearer how you're defining each of those 3 levels. So at this point, I want to turn it over to Courtney to talk in a little bit more detail about developing strategies, but I see that we have a question that has come in the chat window. So Courtney, as you are getting ready to talk about strategies, let's see what that question is. So the question is, are we using outcome and outcome indicators interchangeably? The ROMA manual defines outcome as a general statement without numbers. And so, yes, that's a very good point. And again, what I'm trying to say is you can frame your outcome statements in a number of different ways. Sometimes agencies are a little bit hesitant to put a hard number or a target because they're not sure if they could actually reach it. So they just simply might frame their outcome statement as, say, reducing poverty in their service area or providing high-quality child care to families with low incomes, that have children that are eligible for child care. Other agencies may say reducing poverty by 50% or 25%. So again, there are a number of different ways to frame your outcomes, and I think that's why, first of all, you want to have a ROMA trainer or a ROMA implementer as you are defining your outcomes and strategies. But I think you do have some flexibility in how you frame that up, as long as your outcome is specific and measurable. I really think the first 2 parts of that SMART framework are the most important one. As long as it's clear what kind of outcome you're trying to achieve, and as long as you can measure whether you're going to achieve it, then whether you put a number in there or choose to frame it more broadly, I think is more up to the agency. So that's an excellent question, and again, another good advertisement for why you want to make sure that you've got your ROMA trainers around the table as you're developing your strategic plan to help you think through how you're framing it. So with that said, I now want to turn it over to Courtney to talk about strategies and writing the strategic plan. Courtney, take it away.
All right, thank you, Jarl. So I'm going to talk a little bit about developing your strategies, and basically what we want to get across here is that the strategies are really a description of what you're already doing, plus some new, where appropriate, of course, based on your community needs assessment. And so an example of this might be maybe you have a child care center, Head Start, a child care quality training for home-based providers, and all of those programs you're doing to provide high-quality child care and education for low-income children and families. So some of what these strategies are that might simply describe existing programs and other activities, you might just be describing, you know, how do these connect together, these programs and services that we're already offering, that are already working well to achieve these outcomes that we've put out there as necessary. And then, you know, how are we doing as far as referrals between programs, targeting clients from one program to another, or maybe sequencing program involvement. So those are things that you would describe just the strategy around what you're doing, rather than just saying the program or service that you're offering. And so kind of as you see here on your screen, these kind of go in order from, you know, least ambitious to most ambitious. So, you know, you're first describing those strategies that you're already doing that you maybe just need to describe how you're delivering it or how you're connecting it. And then you're moving into improvements across existing programs or services, how you might start bundling services, how you're going to maybe improve your customer satisfaction system or your referral system between programs. Another example here might be, you know, switching to a single intake system. And then as you get more ambitious, you also start to go into possibly describing some additional activities with external partners maybe. So this is where you might be developing new referral agreements if you're needing to kind of build up that community capacity around it, where you might not have that single agency capacity, or joining in a community collaborative. So with this, you know, connecting to other service providers, you know, you might be also doing MOUs to help strengthen programs. And then once you bridge into kind of the most ambitious type strategies, then you're looking at strategies that are going to describe new programs, services, and activities. So this might be where you're adding a whole new program to your agency. Maybe you're applying for another grant because you need the resources to be able to fund the program. And so this is really going to be where you're looking at the heavier lift. And so you want to make sure that these are very well balanced in your strategic plan, because you don't want to have a strategic plan that is full of brand new activities, because obviously that's going to involve a very high staff capacity, as well as lots of resources to be able to carry that out. And so being able to kind of combine these different levels of ambition in your strategic plan can help to make a strategic plan that's more able to be implemented more efficiently or more effectively. And then, you know, for every program and service and activity that you're thinking about, you want to make sure that this is also kind of all wrapping up into at least one strategy, and then furthermore into at least one outcome. And so you don't want, of course, you don't want programs or services that aren't tied to any of your outcomes. And likewise, you don't want anything that's not connected to an overall strategy behind the program, services, and activities that you're doing in your agency. And so with this one, you also want to make sure that you are taking time to conduct a comprehensive review of your options. And so not just, you know, looking inside your agency at your own internal data and things like that, like you've already done through the data collection process with the SWOT analysis, but also that you're looking at research in other fields that are related to maybe that program or service, so high quality child care and things like that. So looking outside your agency, looking outside the box, because sometimes we kind of get focused in on, you know, what we've always done, or, you know, just these 3 ways that we maybe see of doing it, but maybe there is some great approach that's out there that we haven't realized just yet. And then also reaching out to other peers with successful programs, so a program that you see running really well or that's got a lot of awareness and outreach behind it, maybe asking questions about that to learn more about how they do it. Also looking at other networks and related fields in your area or even across the nation. And then also you want to think about strategies at all levels, and not only think about the strategies in each of those levels, but how they all work together. So you want to be strategic about your strategies, and there's really 2 levels to that. So you want to be strategic about the strategies themselves, So how you're delivering those strategies, programs, how you're maybe bundling the services together. And then you also want to think about how all the strategies work together to then create those outcomes like I was referring to earlier. And with thinking about the strategies at the individual, family, and community, or individual, family, community, and agency level, you want to also think about how those three levels of strategies work together to go up into one outcome for your agency. And then also, whenever you're thinking about sequencing your strategies over time, just remembering the fact that this is generally, whenever you do strategic planning, it's a 3 to 5 year plan. And so you want to be thinking about how each strategy kind of builds on the next, and the fact that you don't have to do everything in the first year, or you don't have to wait till the third year to do everything either. So you can kind of build it out. So an example of this might be year 1, you start to maybe integrate your services. And in year 2, you start to reach out to other partners and add services to maybe a more holistic community service menu. And then maybe in year 3, you would look at using the comprehensive referral network that you've already, you've built through the internal and external work in year 1 and 2. And then, work on attracting additional funding for that. And so all of that then wraps up into your overall strategy, but you're doing each piece one at a time in an order that makes sense and helps each step out. And then, whenever you're looking at strategic planning, of course, you want to make sure that you're doing at least something new. So you don't want a strategic plan that's just kind of a copy and paste of what you've been doing for, the past 5 years or even the past 20 years. Hopefully, it's not that. So if you're not doing at least one thing different, what we like to say is, that's one of the times we are going to, kind of say, okay, you're doing it wrong. Because there's got to be something that's been realized based on the data that you've collected that you can then do different or new to be able to serve the families and communities of your agency a little bit better. Because really strategic planning and implementing the ROMA cycle is all about that continuous improvement. And so that's where doing something different or new comes in. And then these diagnostic questions for strategies, this is just kind of another way to frame what we've already discussed. And they really help to make sure that you're maybe doing something new based on what you've realized through your SWOT analysis, through your needs assessment. So what can we do to improve outcomes within our core business areas? So that's taking that continuous improvement cycle. What can we do to improve performance around core business areas? What can we do to improve our referral networks or our partnerships? So who do we need to be reaching out to and building relationships with? And then what kind of services can we add? So each of these questions kind of lends itself to, doing something new or different. And whenever we say doing something new, it doesn't mean that you have to draft a whole new program plan and go out and apply for additional grants, but there's ways that you can do things differently to really enhance the way that you're delivering programs or services that maybe are working but could work a little bit better. And then as far as incorporating the national goals and looking at the standards, with Standard 6.2, it requires that strategic plans address one or more goals that seek the reduction of poverty, revitalization of low-income communities, empowerment of people with low incomes. So these are things that are really reflected through the CSBG Act, but the National Community Action Theory of Change also talks about pieces of this within that. So this is where you can kind of start to reflect those 3 national goals. And now there's 3, of course, so we don't have the 6th anymore. But they really focus in on the families, empowering people within their communities, and then, really looking at those broader community strategies. And so to be able to meet this incorporation of the 3 national goals as well as Standard 6.2, it's important that you spell it out in your community or in your strategic plan. And so being able to include a small paragraph or 2 that tells how you're addressing those 3 national goals in your agency, as well as, kind of which goals, the outcome might address. And then how you're working to meet Standard 6.2. So, you know, it might be tempting to just kind of be like, well, yeah, it's incorporated throughout our strategic plan, but really just being able to spell it out for those who are monitoring and looking for these kind of things, you know, including that paragraph in the introduction to this, your strategic plan, can then just get it out there in a very clear way for people to understand. So then whenever we're also looking at incorporating these ROMA target goals, and standard 6.3 requires that strategic plans include one or more of family, agency, and community goals. So this doesn't mean that you have to have all three, although for kind of a well-balanced strategic plan, that is you know, encouraged to do that, but the standard does not require all three are included. But this is another piece where you can just include it in the text of your strategic plan. So putting it in that paragraph in your introduction of how your strategic plan works to meet standard 6.2, 6.3, as well as the national goals. And you can just title it, you know, relation to the national goals or to the organizational standards, and then that can be sufficient for you. So then another piece of this is, you know, you want to know, how do we organize our plan structure? And really we like to try to keep it as simple as possible. I'm sure you all like to keep it as simple as possible as well. But these are kind of those key pieces that we found can be very important to include in the structure. So the first piece is really that executive summary. And this piece is really important because people can come and get that overview of your strategic plan within a short you know, piece of the plan, so that they don't have to look at the whole thing to get the gist of it. But then you go into your introduction, so this is where you talk about your purpose, the process, the stakeholders, kind of that story of how you did the plan and what you did with it. This can also be that piece where you include the information on how you've incorporated the 3 national goals, or how the plan works to meet the organizational standards. Then in that third part, we talk about, you know, you can talk about the assessment summary. So this is where you include the data that you gathered through the community needs assessment, the SWOT analysis, your review of mission, vision, and values. So you're looking at the internal and external information that you've looked at to influence your plan, as well as, you know, the mission, vision, and values that guides your plan. So this is kind of that foundational piece to the plan. And then in the fourth piece, this is where you go into the plan itself. So you're talking about the outcomes that you've identified based on the needs. You're talking about the strategies that you're going to carry out to meet those outcomes. And then, of course, the actions. And another thing that we say, too, is that with the actions and the action planning piece of the strategic plan, you really don't need to do that unless it's something new or different that you're including in your strategic plan. So it's not as necessary to carry out an entire action planning process for something that you're already doing. You might just say kind of how you're doing what you're doing. If there's a small improvement to it, then you do need to spell out how you're going to carry out that improvement. So for example, if you're going to you go after a new grant, then the strategic plan should lay out how you're going to do that. So you're going to talk about who is going to do it, how you're going to do it, what exactly you're going to do, and then when, so that timeline. So those pieces of the plan need to be in there, of course, for the new and different strategies. And then you want those next steps in there. So this is where you really line out, you know, who's going to take charge of what committee to carry out pieces of the strategic plan, the timeline that you're going to go after, how you're going to sequence those activities throughout the 3 or 5 years, however long your plan is, so that it is very clear. And this is where it can really help you implement your strategic plan better. If you're identifying kind of who those champions are for each piece of a strategic plan, and just spelling it out in writing, because that's where that accountability piece can come in, and really lay it out there for everyone involved, as well as kind of keeping that accountability with those who are monitoring and those in the community that might be reading your community or your strategic plan as well. So then when you finalize your plan, you know, this is just some kind of general advice. Your strategic plan should be exactly as long as they need to be, no longer. So not a whole lot of filler, you know, text and information is needed. You know, include the outcomes and strategies, but then you want to let the staff that are involved in the actual activities and carrying out of those strategies, develop those action plans themselves in the next phase. And so with the action planning process, you would develop your outcomes and strategies, and then let the departments that might be carrying out those programs that relate to the strategies really flesh out what the action plan looks like, because they're the ones that deal with that on an everyday basis, and they generally know more about what works and does not work. And this can really help to create better buy-in for your strategic plan as well. Then you want to circulate the plan to key stakeholders. So whenever it's still in its draft phase, kind of do a review with those key stakeholders that are involved. And then you want your final draft to be completed and submitted to the board for approval, and that's part of the organizational standards as well. So in the front end of your strategic plan, we talked about this in our first webinar, is really making sure that you build in that time for that approval process and to be submitted to the board. And even some extra time in case there's something that, kind of comes back as a revision. And then make sure you include the next steps for implementation. Just like I talked about on the previous slide, this is where you really are able to put in the accountability and then really ensure that the plan is going to be implemented most effectively. So at this point, that is kind of our conclusion of this webinar. We've got just a couple minutes, so we'll double check on any questions that we have coming in. I don't think I see any. I don't know if you've seen any, Liza. Okay, one just did come in about, do staff developed action plans belong in the strategic plan document? So what is the next phase? You can definitely include those in your strategic plan document, or you can refer to them. I've seen it done both ways, but sometimes if there's like a program-specific plan, so CSBG is a good example, and if you have outcomes and strategies, and then the CSBG kind of department or the community services department is drafting out those plans through their community action plan or their CSBG work plan, then as long as those connect and the strategies tie to each other, then that can be the actual action plan that is developed. So this is kind of how you see it all tied together. But yes, they can be along with it, but you can also just kind of create it as like an addendum and refer out to that strategic program plan or service plan. There's another question around our agency uses a real-time strategic planning model. And so wanting to have a conversation about that. So yeah, I'd be interested in hearing more about that. And if you want to reach out to us, Jennifer, feel free to, and we can have more of a conversation on that. All right, I think that's all of our questions. Of course, if we missed any, or if you think of some after the webinar, please let me know, and we'll be posting these webinars, the ones we've had, as well as this one, to our website within the next couple of days. And our next session is going to actually be this Thursday, February 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register for that if you go to our website, communityactionpartnership.com, go to the events tab, and then go to webinars. And that's where it lists out our future and upcoming webinars. So with that, I'll go ahead and put our contact information up on the screen. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Jarl or myself as far as the content goes. If you have any questions about the webinars and the recordings and things like that, Liza is also available for questions. So thank you all. We appreciate your time, and we hope you have a great day.